Elia reached for the handle of the door to the medical ward and saw her hands trembling. The booming and vibration of artillery shells was constant. 2 weeks of this skirmish had started to take its toll on her nerves. Still, more soldiers arrived hourly that needed to be tended to. She collected the medical tray offered to her. "Thank you, Andre. How is Sister Brasave today? Did she get any sleep yet?"
"We have worked through most of the night and have run out of space for patients."
The direct hit to the building physically shook the walls, causing the meek Andre to cower and squeak. "Go help Sister. I will tend to Mr. Renish." Elia felt Andre's fear and instinctively wanted to ease her worries. The assistant curtsied and ran down the hall as ordered. The smell of death and rotting flesh permeated the ward. Breakfast quickly turned to bile. Unwilling to admit weakness, she swallowed hard and headed to her first patient of the day. "Good morning, Mr. Renish. How does your leg feel?" she inquired with as much cheer as she could muster as she carefully placed her tray on the bunk, which was marked with a plain 7 at the footboard. "What leg, sister?" His lip quivered slightly at the corner of his mouth. "Don't be impish, Mr. Renish," Elia chided as she tugged the covers aside from the burly soldier's stump. "And I'm not a sister, just a student, for now." "As you say, sister," he nodded, grinning. Elia sighed as she snipped the brown-crusted bandages away from around his shattered knee. There was a slight thumping in the distance, from outside the tall, heavy window. Her hands began to tremble, but she forced herself to continue cutting the fouled rags away. Renish sucked in through his teeth as she gently peeled the bandages away. Air snapped into Elia's face as a loud explosion rattled the windows of the ward. She gasped, jerking the last bit of the bandages off the mangled knee. Renish gave a sharp bark of shock and pain, then a low chuckle as he settled back into his bunk. 3 years of training gave her patient experience, but not during any open hostilities. And why was all this happening? "You're a brave soldier, Mr. Renish." Elia looked at the awake and moaning patients around the rest of the ward. They would all need to be tended to much quicker now that the battle seemed to be heading straight for them. The work never ended thanks to the assault. She spoke louder so that Renish could hear her over the pounding barrage outside and the chorus of moans and wails from the other patients. She began to quickly dab the mangled stump where the scabs had ripped and began leaking blood. 2 days ago, Renish arrived here with his leg blown off. Though it is still an ugly wound, he was strong and it was already beginning to heal. "Just tell me when we're moving out, sister." Renish grimaced with only the slightest strain in his voice as she wrapped up his leg. "Have you been drinking again, Mr. Renish? You were bleeding a lot. You know what Sister Brasave says about drinking," Elia murmured confidentially to her patient. "Renish!" shouted Sister Brasave over another loud explosion. The burly sister glowered at Renish as she snatched a bowl of clean water brought in by one of the helpers, Andre. "Don't you even think about alcohol, you hooligan!" She turned to the trembling waif in front of her. "Set the basket on the cupboard, child. There's a good girl. Now, off about your other rounds." She gave Andre a warm smile, then shooed her away, then glowered back over to the grinning Mr. Renish. Renish assumed a wounded look. His smile was meant to be disarming. The effect was contrary. "Me, sister? I never dream of it." He grinned and winked at Elia as the big sister turned back to the supplies with a hump. Elia shook her head and finished tying off the bandage around Renish's leg. She then replaced the covers and tucked them in. She looked up and noticed a small lump next to the soldier's large side. "Is that—" She pointed at the lump, eyebrow arched. Renish put a finger to his lips and winked. Then he reached into the covers and pulled out a small flask. Elia straightened, put her hands on her hips, and cocked her head slightly to one side. "I will have you know that while you are under the care of this ward, you—" She jerked her head around as the wooden door to the ward swung open, bringing the combat closer. A short, stocky soldier at once hobbled in with another soldier over a large shoulder. "This boy needs a doc, sisters!" the short soldier shouted through the hall. "But we don't have any more," Elia said quietly, mostly to herself. "Down at the far end, next to the last bunk," barked Sister Brasave as she at once started grabbing at all the supplies she had just organized in the cupboard. "Builder's Holy Workshop," Renish choked. "Sergeant Sheridan! And— oh no!"
"Bed's taken, sister,"
another sister responded. "By the dead." Brasave rushed over and grabbed a large handful of the sheets and yanked the still bundle onto the floor with one powerful tug. "The living have more use of it. Elia, bring a tray." Elia was already at the cupboard, snatching at poultices, salves, implements, and bandages, shakily hurling them onto the tray. It clattered in her trembling hands as she dodged past the 2 other soldiers who leaned in, silent and bloody, at the door. "Come in or get out, you 2!" shouted Sister Brasave as she ripped open the wounded soldier's dirty, ragged gray coat and the blood-stained shirt beneath. "Builder, protect him. It's a punctured lung." As she set down the tray on the rickety little stool next to the bunk, Elia could see the skinny, barreled chest of the soldier. He was more of a boy, and bubble and froth had formed where a ball had penetrated just to the right of his sternum. "Give me the sheepskin. We must seal it over the wound so he can breathe easier. But God help us if the ball did not exit out his back. Poultice!" As Brasave hastily applied the sticky concoction around the whistling wound, Elia turned to the motionless sergeant. "What's his name, sir?" He looked up at her. Elia held his dark, even gaze for a moment, then looked away, unable to bear his look of despair and shock. "Mornings." His voice was flat. "Private Mornings." The 2 soldiers behind him, a towering fat one wearing a uniform that was too loose, and a skinny one that was hunched over, shuffled and looked about the ward. As Elia moved up to the head of the bed, she saw Brasave pause and shoot a glance back at the sergeant, then continue her work. "Slow, deep breaths, Mr. Mornings." She wiped the blood and grime from his sweaty, pale face with a warm rag. The only noise he made was the quick, labored gasps for air as his blue, bloodshot gaze darted around in fear and confusion. "Slow, deep breaths. That will give you the air you need. Try to be calm. It's going to be okay." "I'm going to need to roll him on his side," said Brasave. "I've got to see if it went through." The stocky sergeant that Mr. Renish called Sheridan turned to his 2 men. "You soldiers going to ignore Private Renish over there?" They slowly turned and shuffled over to Mr. Renish's bunk. The sergeant loomed closer, thick, dirty fingers fidgeting with his black shako hat. "How's my soldier doing, sister?" "Help me roll him on his side and we will see." The sergeant, the sister, and Elia all grabbed onto the wounded and pulled or pushed him onto his side. Elia looked down as the boy gave out a thin wheeze. "Sister, saints preserve him." "What? What happened, sister?" "The boy is dead." Brasave stood, wiping her hands on a bloody rag and tossing it onto the tray. "I'm sorry, Sergeant." "Just like that? I mean, he was just... Sister, this is my soldier. He..." The sergeant pointedly rubbed his sunken, deep-set eyes with his thumb and forefinger. "What am I going to tell his old man?" he asked the whitewashed wall. "There will be many fathers and mothers to break the terrible news to." Brasave arched a thick eyebrow at the sergeant as she picked up her tray and strode past him. "Tell his father he died a hero's death." Elia turned to the boy's frozen face and closed the eyelids over the wide, glassy blue eyes. Just a boy. Another one of so many others they had been unable to save. An explosion boomed just outside the university. Everything shook. Elia did not even notice the impact of the shockwave snapping through her chest. She thought she could hear the din of musket fire somewhere a few streets over. How many had been younger than her? Like this one. "Elia!" She jerked her head up. Brasave was already rewrapping the bandaged arm of another patient. "Would you tell Andre to fetch the stretcher, boys, please?" The sergeant now stood with hunched shoulders next to Mr. Renish's bunk, speaking quietly with his soldiers. He glanced over at Brasave, then at Elia. "My boys will carry him out. One last time. I'm sure the stretcher-bearers are busy. Would you show them the way, sister?" He turned to Elia, his dark eyes brimming. "I'm not actually Of course, Sergeant." Sheridan turned and slapped Renish on his shoulder. "You rest up, soldier. Get better and get out of here. You're one of my best soldiers." He spoke to Mr. Renish in a cheery tone, with only the slightest hint of sorrow beneath. His smile looked warm and genuine, but his eyes still reflected his sadness and pain. The 2 other soldiers who had been quiet moved back over to the deceased boy's bunk. Renish looked up at the sergeant. "Give him hell, Sergeant Sheridan." Renish's eyes filled with unshed tears as he looked over at the body hoisted by the two others. "Make them pay," he hissed. "It's looking grim out there." His dirty fingers scratched the stubble under his square jaw. "General Dawson is holding all of the regulars at the Delta, while the militia helps the civilians out of the city. It ain't looking good, though. We were ordered to assist the hospital move out as soon as possible." "How soon do we have, Sergeant?" "Difficult to say. Best guess? A day, tops." Brasave turned sharply to the big sergeant. "A day? How are we supposed to evacuate this whole facility? The staff alone will take days to." "That's why we're here, sister. The militia and city guard are spent organizing the evacuation of the central district and market squares. Since our squad is so depleted, they ordered us to help y'all move out of here." Elia felt a sinking pile of lead threatening the bottom of her stomach. She straightened and walked towards the door. "If you would kindly follow this way, gentlemen." She walked briskly down the long, narrow corridor which led from the medical wing of the university to the courtyard. The halls used to be quiet, filled only by the sound of creaking boards underfoot as the students bustled between their studies and caring for the sick patients in the wards. The whitewashed walls would resound with the muffled echoes of sisters giving lectures to their pupils. Elia could no longer hear those creaks over the sound of the moaning and crying of the overflowing medical rooms. She could no longer walk down the hallway at an easy pace. She had to weave between half-running orderlies and haggard citizens carrying the wounded or the dead. "Is it bad out there, as the sergeant said?" She looked over her shoulder at the skinny, hunched soldier carrying the legs of his fallen comrade. "We had 20 men in our squad 3 days ago." His voice was quiet and calm, but he sounded tired. His green round eyes darted to and from each person they passed. "The Shanim forces pushed their way from the landing at the docks all the way through the Delta district before we could rally and face them." "Shanim? So that's who attacked us." Elia shook her head. "But that doesn't make any sense. They are traders and merchants. The Shanim have not attacked anyone in 300 years. And we have been trading partners and allies since the collapse of the Adrian." "True, but there they are, by the dozens and by the scores. There wasn't no warning or declaration, as far as we knew either. They were just pounding the harbor with artillery. Then they were dropping ramps, and out springs whole hordes of them." Elia made her way around the corner to the main wing of the university. The ceiling opened, revealing the overhead balcony of the second floor. Lining the side wall along the stairs hung pictures of each Mother Superior that had presided over the Talatin University of Medical Knowledge. They shook and trembled with each proximate blast of artillery shells raining down on the city around the university. "The courtyard is just out this way." She led them behind the front desk and down another narrow corridor. This one had no windows and was almost completely dark. She could hear the breathing of the men behind her increase as they shifted and redistributed their awkward burden. At the end of the hallway, the heavy door opened into the courtyard. Elia inhaled as slowly and deeply as possible against the cold, which instantly reached out to stab her ribs beneath her bloodied wool apron and light blue dress. The trees were barren with the coming of winter. The grass was brown and close-fitted to the earth beneath. 4 men in soiled, ragged clothes and ragged jackets moved about the center of the courtyard. They heaved up bodies and threw them into a freshly dug pit. Smoke billowed out from the pit. The smell of burning flesh and cloth hung heavily in the air. I'm sorry." Elia turned and looked back at the 2 men as they stepped through the door. "This is the best we can do, right now. We have no time to bury all of them." "It's better than some have at the front," said Rollins blandly. "They lay where they fall, sister, and we might not even have the time to burn them here much longer." She turned away from them and continued trudging over the barren grounds toward the workers. "I only pray that we have enough time to evacuate the wounded." "Over here!" One of the men motioned to Elia and her followers. "Add 'em to the pile. There's room." The soldiers walked over and awkwardly dropped the thin body over the edge of the pit. It fell onto the others in a twisted position, with one arm caught behind the back. "Would you mind saying a few words, sister?" She felt her guts clench. She found it difficult to swallow. "I'm not a She looked into the eyes of the 2 soldiers, then nodded. Closing her eyes and bowing her head, she tried to think of something to say. However, it was difficult to come up with words while trying to focus past the distant sounds of battle, the gunfire, the smoke, and the smell. A standard prayer from the books would have to do. Great Builder, Constructor of the earth and all living things, we thank you for sparing the materials to provide this one's body and soul. The gunfire seemed louder now. Someone was shouting inside, screaming something she could not make out. Another body landed on the pile, the whump of flames and fresh puff of stirred ash wafting up from the pit. We humbly give back those materials now to you. The door behind them, which they had come through, banged open.
They've broken through! They're here!
She heard Andre's shrill voice, now just a squeak with stark terror. Elia's eyes snapped open. A large paned window from the second story banged open and a moaning body rolled out. The young nurse watched in stiff, frozen terror as the body flipped, seeming to move as if through water, and the moan ended abruptly with a sound of crunching and wet sausages in a bag tossed to the ground. Gunfire and chaos emanated from the open window. She turned to the soldiers next to her, who were frantically unslinging their muskets from across their backs. A face appeared in the window, shouting something unintelligible. The gravediggers bolted for the far door to the utility wing. The face in the window raised a musket. A large arm closed around Elia's shoulders from behind and whirled her around to one side. She heard the musket ball bounce off a stone where both she and Rollins had been. She looked up at him. The shako cap he wore covered his eyes, but she could see they remained unemotional and unconcerned. "Reed," he said calmly to his friend. The skinny soldier, Reed, had also donned his own cap, a steel helmet with a spike at the top and a face mask folded above his eyebrows. Reed nodded, all the nervous anxiety and jitteriness gone. Reed looked steely and ready for battle. All nervousness seemed to have disappeared once battle ensued. He raised his musket and engaged the charging hammer. White smoke billowed out everywhere around them. Elia heard the sharp grunt from the window. "This is my home. My home is now a battleground. These two will quickly be overrun, and I will die with them. They are throwing out the patients. What kind of animals would do such a thing? I must escape. I must hide." "Apologies, sister." Rollins's enwrapped arm retreated from her. He spun as another ball whizzed by. He tilted his musket up and shot from his hip. Amazingly, she heard another sharp scream and another wet crunch on the ground through the ringing in her ears.
"We have to get out of here. We won't last out in the open."
Her own screaming voice sounded muffled and small. "She's right, Rollins. We have to get back to the sergeant. They're already in that wing. Follow me." "No, we must get back to Sergeant Sheridan." Both soldiers knelt and fumbled with their powder canisters, reloading their muskets as fast as their trembling, frantic fingers would allow. "Mr. Rollins?" She placed her hands on her hips, mustering as much command in her voice as she could. "Am I not a sister of the Holy Order of Healing?" He looked up at her with a blank look. "But you're not actually a sister." "You keep calling me sister." "This is a hospital, and I hold authority within its walls." He slammed the ramrod down the end of his musket, looking over to Reed. The hunched soldier stared back and shrugged, dropping his steel mask and leveling his musket. "I'm trying to save your lives, both of your lives. Let us go." Rollins sighed and stood slowly. "Lead the way, sister." The big soldier looked over at the window and fired. Another cry. She ran as fast as her skirts would allow to a door in the dormitory wing. A bullet bounced to the left of the door. Reed fired his shot, faring better. She jerked the door open and hurried the two men inside. Distant shouts sounded down the corridor. Hurried footsteps above made the ceiling boards growl in staccato bursts. "Come on!" She walked briskly down the corridor and up the winding stairs to the second floor where her dormitory was. As she rounded the corner to the left in the second-story corridor, she came face to face with a glaring, angry face. It was a Sean trooper. His green eyes were hard and cold. She stared at him, only inches away. Her mouth was agape, but she did not know what she was going to say or do. She felt rigid, paralyzed, like her limbs weighed 1,000 pounds of steel. How to explain the two soldiers behind her? She looked down at his musket, the bayonet fixed on the end of the long barrel. A bayonet passed over her shoulder and dug into the eye of the angry trooper. Blood exploded from the socket as Reed passed around her and continued to stab, bearing the enemy soldier down to the far wall of the hallway, stabbing at his face and neck all the while. She stood, stunned, her vision blurred with tears. How can people be so savage? I must get them to safety. She looked down the long corridor. There was nobody else here, and her dormitory was close. We're almost there. She hurried along to the third door on the left. She shoved it open and entered her sparse little room. Books spilled haphazardly on the little shelves on the wall above the headboard of her little bed, and on the desk in the far corner. The small wood stove in the opposite corner was cold. They had not received proper fuel since the invasion began 2 weeks ago. The room was utterly Spartan, other than a vase of dried flowers and a small portrait of a woman on her desk. Even in the present circumstances, Elia could not help but feel the pang of sorrow and regret at the picture. The woman had Elia's almost exact likeness. Her brown hair draped in waves down the sides of her head and piled over her shoulders. Her round cheeks and high cheekbones framed a wide but graceful nose and large blue eyes. The mouth curled up ever so slightly at the ends in a kindly smile. Elia wondered what her mother would have done had she been here. She would have known exactly what to do, and done it with nothing but straight-backed confidence and persevering joy. Elia wished she felt like that now. "They'll find us in here. We should have just tried to escape," whispered Reed, snapping her mind quickly back to the situation at hand. "There wasn't time. They would have killed you. They won't find you in here. See?" She pointed at a little door in the ceiling just above her desk. "You can hide up there." She flung her medical books from the desk. "Stand on this. They're coming down the hallway." First Rollins, then Reed stood on the desk. Pushing the little door aside, they slipped up into the crawl space. Rollins had a tough time getting up, but Reed gave him a leg up, straining to push his heavy friend with his small wiry frame. Just before he slid the little trapdoor back, Reed looked down at her from the darkness. His mask looked still and blank. "Thank you, sister. Please, if you can, if he's still alive, find the sergeant for us. Save him, if you can." "I'll do my best." Those knots in her stomach had not gone away. In fact, they had only gotten worse. "Now hide and stay quiet. Do not move. I will bring you food later, and we will figure out how to get out of here." "My ward. They were just hurling them out, like garbage. Sister Brasave, the sergeant. I must make sure they're okay." There was a loud banging on her door as the trap door in the ceiling slid shut. She jolted at the thunderous sound. There was just enough time to kneel by her bed as the door slammed open. Enemy troopers flooded into the room. Elia looked at them, her heart slammed in her ears. She quickly raised her hands at the dripping bayonet advancing towards her face. "Down on the ground! Lie down on the friggin' ground!" screamed an ugly man with a thick, hoarse, heavy accent. She could not even understand his first few words. I'm a student nurse. Please don't." Her whole body trembled. The faces looked barely human, all twisted in rage and anger. I didn't mean any." "Ground!" A rough hand dragged her by the shoulder to the floorboards. "Now!" She looked up and saw 5 more men around the room, checking under her bed and hurling her books to the floor. "Others! Where?" She could feel hot breath on her ear. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. "They are where?" I don't know what you're talking about." "Do not look at the ceiling. Do not look at the ceiling." "Hospital. Which?" "Hospital? Yes, this is a hospital. I don't know what—"
"Which friggin' hospital?"
"I work in Ward C."
"Why here? Where others?"
The big hand grabbed her by the hair braided against her skull and twisted her head painfully backwards. She stared up at the light brown fiery eyes, the sneering mouth, the crinkled dirty nose. I was scared. I work in Ward C." She felt the hot streams rolling down her cheeks from her burning eyes. One of the other soldiers spoke briefly to the one holding her. She could not understand what they said. She had never been good at languages. All the arduous work of her tutor had been in vain.
Stupid frit.
He hauled her up, staggering and floundering to her feet.
Which hospital?
Ward C! Hospital C! Her tongue kept failing her. It had a mind of its own and kept working to wet the inside of her mouth, and failing. The large hand let go of her hair and shoved her between the shoulder blades towards the door.
There! Go there!
She staggered toward the door, hands still held up placatingly.
See, go see.
Throughout the hospital, between the dormitory wing and the ward wing, the fighting had stopped. Here and there, Elia stepped over the bodies of soldiers or bleeding orderlies. Enemy troops were all around. They ran through every corridor and stood at every corner. Some growled at her as she passed, all faces leering and snarling. Some spoke briefly to the man pushing her. Most just looked on blankly. When they arrived at the door toward C, she felt a pang go through her whole body.
How could you kill a holy sister?
There lay Brasave in the doorway, blood pooled all around from a small gash in her thick throat.
That's blasphemy! It's against the war code!
She went to kneel over the body, but a shove from behind sent her sprawling over her dead mentor through the door. She looked up, gasping in disbelief.
What are you doing? Builder, preserve us! They're unarmed!
A cuff to the back of her skull made her vision blur as a soldier dragged her to her feet again. Her vision cleared to the sight of enemy troopers stabbing patients.
My patients!
And promptly hurling them out the open windows. There was only one left giving them trouble. Renish was laughing, hoarse and insane.
Pathetic.
He twisted sideways in his bunk, barely dodging a downward bayonet thrust from the trooper standing over him.
Where is Sergeant Sheridan? Did they already throw him from the window? Builder, make them stop!
Her eyes blurred again with tears. A sob leapt unbidden from her chest.
Why is this happening? Why are they attacking us?
Renish grabbed at a bayonet with his bare hands, blood welling from between his fingers as he twisted it from the rifle. Another trooper took aim at him. Renish threw his flask at the trooper's face with his other hand.
Play fair!
He laughed as the deafening shot went wild, chipping white plaster from the wall. White smoke drifted around the room. The soldier behind her thrust her aside and lunged toward the bed. Renish flipped the bayonet around and stabbed it under the chin of its owner, grinning impishly up into the shocked, gawping face. The big redhead grabbed his bedside mug and hurled it at the approaching trooper, laughing at the responding curse. He twisted out of bed, landing awkwardly, belly to the bloodied floor. He roared up at the recovering trooper, grabbing his legs and dragging him to the ground. The soldier screamed in terror, awkwardly trying to swing his musket as Renish stabbed the bayonet into his leg repeatedly, further up each time. Elia started from her sickened stupor as a small figure passed her and walked up to the wrestling pair. It was a trooper, but his green and white uniform had much more embroidery on the shoulder pads and coat tails. It was also much cleaner than the rest. In his right hand, he held a shako cap with green plumage. In his left, he held a pistol. More soldiers pushed her out of the way and filled the room. They carried their wounded among them and placed them on the now empty beds.
No!
She cried out as the officer placed the pistol against Renish's head. Renish looked up at the small man and his pistol.
Get fucked!
He snarled up at him, twisting the bayonet in his victim. The enemy officer let out one short chuckle.
Game is up, my friend.
He spoke clearly and intelligibly, but still with a thick Shan accent. The pistol boomed out, smoke engulfing Renish's face as he toppled off his victim against his own bunk. The soldier spun on his heel and looked at Elia as if noticing her for the first time. He smiled, thick lips twisting up into what looked more like a sneer.
Apologies, sister.
He had a crisp, clean manner of speaking, and was very concise, despite a thick accent. He looked down at the corpse lying in the doorway. Holstering his pistol, he ran a hand through short, dirty blonde hair.
Damn it! I thought I told them only to kill the wounded.
He looked up at her, his sharp gray eyes calculating.
I suppose you can care for this ward, yes?
What? I mean, pardon?
This ward? You are a sister as well? You will care for my men now, yes?
She could not hold that steel gaze. He spoke as if he were asking a favor over some spiced herbal tea on a lawn in the summer during a dance.
My men require care.
Yes, sir. I can care for the wounded, but—
Good. I have many wounded men, and I am glad you will care for them regardless of your personal feelings on this present situation.
He smiled again. She looked down at her bloodied, now tattered apron.
I am Captain Jacob Harmon. If you need anything or if my men are less than becoming, find me. Work well and you will be well cared for.
Yes, sir. But what about—
If you will excuse me, I must secure the safety of this facility.
He strode over the body of her mentor and down the hall. Her teeth clicked as her mouth closed. She surveyed the now chaotic ward around her. My ward, either way. In all the beds, the wounded still moaned and cried just the same. It was like nothing had changed. Everything has changed. She clenched her fists, then slowly let them go. That feeling in the pit of her stomach had grown, threatening to swallow her. She wanted to scream. She wanted to stop and crumble and simply do nothing. The enemies threw Renish's body out the window. She felt blank. It is my duty to care for the wounded, regardless of station or nationality. No, it is not. You're not even a pledged sister. It is. I must care for those in need. But one thing is certain. Myself and those two in the crawlspace will escape, one way or another, at any cost.